the cabless Dash 8s. What? What? Why would you ever? No, stop everything. Please, I am begging you. Tell me these are just meant to be slugs, because at least in that vein, it would make some sense.
Well, sort of.
I'm about to be really mad, aren't I?
Like a number of railroads in the United States, the General Electric Dash 8 series would become a staple of rail operations, proving to be powerful and, turbo failures aside, mostly dependable locomotives. Between 1988 and 1995, 40 locomotives were delivered to both BHP and the Goldsworthy Mining Company for use in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. Being Dash 8 locomotives was however the only thing in common between the Australian locomotives and the fleet operating throughout North America. Out of the 40 locomotives built, 36 would be rebuilt on the underframes of old Alco Century locomotives, which once dominated the iron ore trains running through the region. In addition, a locally designed end cab, known as the Pilbara cab, was fitted to most of the Dash 8 fleet.
So they aren't Dash 8s?
Well, yes, but actually no.
You're on thin ice over here, dingo!
This already rather unique series of locomotives would get even weirder in 1994. 3 Dash 8 units, becoming BHP 5663-65, were requested to be built as cabless B units, fitted with Locotrol control equipment for mid-train assistance service. The end where the cab would normally be fitted was instead used as a cabinet to contain the Locotrol equipment. These locomotives, however, didn't last long in this form. Locotrol equipment was constantly getting smaller, and it also became annoying to try and drive a locomotive without a cab.
Really? Why?
Cabs are important.
I know that, you know that, any sensible person would know that, but apparently they didn't.
So, you think I'm sensible?
No!
In 1997, the equipment cabinets were removed and standard Pilbara cabs fitted. This made the locomotives more useful to BHP, and they would remain in service until finally being scrapped, along with nearly all of the Dash 8 fleet between 2015 and 2016.
So, basically, removing the cabs was a complete waste of time and money.
Yeah, pretty much.
The Sydney Trambulance.
Australia was only a young nation when World War I commenced in 1914. Having become a self-governing country in 1901.
Did you perhaps consider violent upheaval to cast off the chains of your colonial abusers prior to that? That's what we did.
We were a bit more polite about the whole situation. Despite the relatively small population at the time, people enlisted to serve in huge numbers. Unfortunately, a number would return home off the ships wounded and in need of treatment. So many wounded soldiers were returning to Sydney that alternative arrangements had to be made to move the injured from the wharf to the hospital. To cater for the number of returning servicemen, the Sydney tramway system was called upon. Built originally in 1899, C-Class trams 31 and 44 had been displaced from passenger service as newer and larger trams entered traffic prior to the war beginning. During October 1915, these trams were pulled aside and converted to become a coupled pair of tram ambulances. At the coupled end in the middle, the original bulkheads and dash panels were removed, while the interior was modified to transport 8 stretchers in 2 layers. Between both trams, 16 patients and accompanying nursing staff could be transported. To make the ride as smooth as possible, the stretchers were placed in sprung-loaded mounts. These cars had been converted for hospital service by the 20th of October 1915, and the trambulance was born.
Now hold on just a second. Is your insistence on the term tram over trolley just because you want to make a terrible pun?
You've got to admit, trolleybulance doesn't really have the same ring to it. Patients were loaded onto the trambulance straight off the ship at Woolloomooloo Wharf to a special siding provided opposite the No. 4 General Military Hospital at Randwick, the present-day Prince of Wales Hospital. Despite the rather unusual choice of transport, the tram ambulance was noted as being smoother than any other method of patient transport then in use, while offering the capacity needed for military service.
I'm not gonna lie here, I actually don't have a single bad thing to say about this idea, mostly because it really worked. And if the rails are there, you might as well use them. I'm sure there was many a soldier incredibly grateful for a smooth ride to the hospital for further treatment that they desperately would have needed.
Following the end of the war in 1918, it seemed like the need for the ambulance trams was no longer there. However, the Spanish flu epidemic would necessitate a prolonged period of service. Patients with the Spanish flu were taken from their homes to the city before being transported by tram to the Coast Hospital, now the Prince Henry Hospital, in Little Bay, with up to 3 ambulance trips a day being run. After the Spanish flu epidemic had subsided, C-Class trams 31 and 44 were formally withdrawn from service in November 1924 and were scrapped a couple of months later.
Which is honestly a shame. They would have made an awesome piece at any war or railway museum.
A crying shame indeed.
The six-wheeler. Okay. It's a tank engine.
Is it?
Yes?
Well, sometimes.
What do you mean, sometimes?
The Marrowa tramway in Tasmania was known for using recycled, or at least heavily rebuilt motive power throughout its existence.
Based on this story so far, I kind of thought that was just every Australian railway.
Yeah, but they were notorious for it.
Even by the standards we've established so far?
Yep.
Oh, that's neat.
Extending 28 miles, or 45 kilometres west of Smithton on the northwest coast of Tasmania, the line was built to tap the timber reserves around Dismal Swamp. One locomotive used was an 060 tank engine, creatively known as the six-wheeler, while at Marrowa.
Y'all really just went with six-wheeler, huh? You could have named her anything. Beth, Sarah, Karen, I don't care anything else.
And they went with that. Yeah, I agree, it's boring. Anyway, originally built in 1890 by Hudswell Clark in the UK, it started life as a contractor's engine. After going through several owners and being used on several different construction jobs, it eventually found itself in Tasmania, being purchased by sawmiller J.S. Lee in Smithton. When the Marrowa tramway was formally purchased by the Tasmanian Public Works Department in 1914, the locomotive was immediately leased from Lee, with the PWD later purchasing the engine outright in November 1915. Following an overhaul in 1916, it was back at work on the Marrowa tramway, where it would remain until withdrawn from service in 1938 or 39. It wasn't scrapped, however, and was sold to another one of the timber millers using the Marrowa tramway, F. Yeager, on the Salmon River branch. By this point, the locomotive was noted as being in a very poor condition, and even had a replacement boiler and saddle tank from a different locomotive fitted to it.
How many times have your people done this, Dingo?
In 1945, the boiler was finally condemned. There was still life left in part of the locomotive though. A Cleatrack logging crawler engine was fitted to the frames, and a chain drive was run from the engine to the rear axle, with the original side rods being used to connect all the wheels together.
No.
Oh yes.
No.
Yes.
It's time to stop.
Oh, there's no stopping. In this form, the locomotive was used in the timber forest from 1945 until 1949, when it was set aside. It was dumped next to the Marrowa Road from 1949 until 1972, when it was recovered for static display. The engine was removed and a spare steam boiler placed in the frames for display. It would remain in this rather rough and forlorn state until the remains were removed and dumped in the Marrowa tip, sometime between 1976 and 1984.
Wait. If she was dumped, is she still out there? Right in the same spot they left her?
Unknown, at least as far as my research shows. Someone should really check that.
Do y'all just like throwing used locomotives in the middle of nowhere?
It's a national pastime.
The Piggyback, or Piggyback. Wait, no. No, don't tell me y'all...
Remember your video on our rail gauge troubles?
You did not seriously do this, please. Tell me right now that you didn't actually do this.
Well, I could, but that would be a lie. Following the Second World War, the narrow gauge Central Australia Railway, run by the Commonwealth Railways and running through the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, was being swamped with rapidly growing quantities of coal, running from the coalfields at Lee Creek to the power stations in Adelaide. The line was completely inadequate for the task, consisting of light rails, little to no ballast, tight curves, and heavy mountain gradients. When combined with the steadily growing passenger and general freight traffic running from Port Augusta through to Alice Springs, the old narrow gauge line was being swamped. The decision to build a new power station at Port Augusta, running on the coal sourced from Lee Creek, would only make matters worse. Something had to be done. In 1950, construction commenced on a new standard gauge line running on the flat plains to the west of the Flinders Ranges to replace the original route. By 1955, the new standard gauge railway had reached Brecina, 145 kilometres or 90 miles from Port Augusta. Although the new line wasn't completed, it had now been extended enough to replace the original narrow gauge route. So keen were the Commonwealth Railways to use the new line for coal trains that they got creative. 3 train sets of 16 flat wagons were coupled together and narrow gauge rails laid on top. This would allow a narrow gauge train to be shunted up a ramp and onto the flat wagons. These wagons would be coupled together to a buffer stop at the end of the flat wagons, air brakes connected to the standard gauge locomotive and hand brakes wound on. After the journey from Brecina to Port Augusta, the narrow gauge wagons would be pulled off the standard gauge ones before being unloaded at the power station. This practice was known as piggyback working, more commonly known as piggybacking. This unusual method of working was quite successful. Within a few weeks, not only was all the coal being moved on piggyback trains, but cattle and some general freight services from further north were also being moved in this manner. Coal trains would operate on the new standard gauge line proper from the 26th of June 1956, but the piggyback trains would continue to run for a short while longer. Eventually, the standard gauge line would be extended further north, reaching Maree, 349 kilometres or 217 miles north of Port Augusta. The piggyback train sets would be used only to transport narrow gauge rolling stock from the surviving Maree to Alice Springs section to the workshops in Port Augusta. Eventually, dedicated heavy transport flat wagons would be built to replace the piggyback train sets. Something wrong?
Everything. Absolutely everything you just said has made me violently angry.
Oh? Why's that?
Did you all consider, and follow me on this, just using the money to make these things and, I don't know, re-gauge the friggin' rails?
Well, the lines were busy.
Dingo, I think you know this is absurd.
But it worked.
I don't care if it worked. It's just another band-aid on an overall problem that your country refused to fix for over a century. The ballast locomotive. That looks just like a boiler in a box.
That is basically what it is.
Why can't you just be normal?
We eat kangaroos.
What?
Anyways, the first railway to use steam locomotives in Australia was the Melbourne and Hobsons Bay Railway, running from Flinders Street in Melbourne, the site of Flinders Street Station today, to Port Melbourne. Work building the line had commenced in 1853, and to provide motive power, 4 2-for-0 locomotives were ordered from Robert Stephenson & Co in the UK, due for delivery by May 1854. However, delays were multiplying and the locomotives ordered would not arrive in time.
Admittedly, I kinda get the necessity here. I suppose shipping locomotives from quite literally the opposite side of the planet would take some time.
That was a lot of our problems. Getting new supplies took forever, so we pretty much had to always get creative with the junk lying around. For even at the birth of Australian steam railways, leftover parts could be used to make an engine. A local company, Robertson, Martin and Smith, was asked to build a locomotive for the contractor building the railway. A 4-wheel ballast wagon was taken to the workshops and would form the basis of a new locomotive. A boiler, cylinders and other components from a pile-driving engine were placed into the ballast wagon. With all the building work done, the new locomotive was tested successfully for the first time on the 30th of May 1854. The locomotive was soon used to haul directors of the company on a ride, riding in ballast wagons behind a locomotive built out of a ballast wagon.
Ballastception.
A speed of 29 km per hour or 18 miles per hour was attained, to the surprise of everyone gathered. Following this spectacular local success, news came that the imported engines would be delayed even further. Robertson, Martin and Smith was once again contracted to build a locomotive for the company, from scratch. This locomotive was a 222 tank engine with only one cylinder and was renowned for almost instantly smashing its driving axle. When this new locomotive was out for frequent repairs, the makeshift ballast locomotive was called in repeatedly to save the day.
Y'all had a locomotive that was famous for breaking herself constantly?
Yeah, why? Don't you?
Ha! Yeah, several. We're all in glass houses on that front.
After several months of using one locomotive that sometimes worked and one built out of spare parts, the long-delayed Robert Stephenson locomotives finally arrived in Melbourne. The first locomotive entered service on Christmas Day 1854, being the best Christmas present the company could have hoped for. The new locomotives provided all services on the line as soon as they were ready. Unfortunately, not much is known about the fate of the pioneering ballast locomotive. The local spare parts wonder that would define a proud Australian engineering tradition.
You, of course, refer to the tradition of creating horrors beyond comprehension because the UK couldn't be bothered to send y'all decent things in a timely manner.
We're all survivors down here.
You put a boiler in a wagon!
And probably took it apart and reused it again for something else. Who knows?
Someone knows! Ask around!
Also, subscribe to my channel.
Or don't. He'll only show you more terror.
Some people like that. They all enjoyed you talking about bad trains after all.
Shut up, Dingo!